It was cold in Kate's cell, and dark, and in the morning she was going to die. She slept fitfully, tossing and turning in fever-bright dreams of burning. She woke with the dawn. Its pale grey light leaked in through the high-barred window of her cell. When she'd first been thrown in here, she'd entertained fantasies that Robin might come swinging through that window to rescue her. But she'd soon realised that it wasn't big enough to fit her own shoulders through, let alone his broader frame. Besides, why should he come for her? It wasn't like she meant anything to him, and it was hardly his fault she was here. She had to face facts. No one was coming for her. She really was going to die, in the most horrible way imaginable. Her breath grew ragged with panic, and she felt lightheaded. She was afraid she might faint, but that would never do. She had to face her end with dignity. It was the only thing she had left. She hadn't been told the exact time of her death, but an hour or so after sunrise a sloppy breakfast of boiled oats was shoved through the door. She forced herself to eat it, chewing each mouthful 10 times before swallowing. It tasted disgusting, but it might be the last thing she ever ate, and she wanted to savour it. She tried to think what she'd say before they burnt her. Robin, she was sure, would have been ready with some witty quip. But then Robin would never have allowed himself to be caught in this situation in the first place. The cell's straw bed was crawling with lice. In the night she'd heard the scuttling of larger creatures, and she could see the marks of rats' teeth in the wooden door. Her legs were weak with fear, but she wouldn't let herself lie down again. Instead, she leaned against the wall, the stone cold and damp against her shoulders. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard a key grating in the lock. Her knees nearly gave out then. Only the wall kept her upright as the door swung open. She wasn't surprised to see Gisborne waiting for her outside. He looked like he'd had no more sleep than her. She stared at him for a long, silent moment. "It's time," he told her eventually. She nodded, her throat suddenly too thick to speak. "I'm sorry," he said. But he didn't seem to be speaking to her. His face looked desperately sad. Kate suddenly found herself feeling sorry for him, which was ridiculous, because this was the man who had killed her brother and now was about to do the same to her. "Do I get a last request?" she asked him. His eyes seemed to focus on her at last, and his expression hardened. "No." She nodded brusquely. "Well, let's get on with it then." The sheriff was very pleased with the turnout. Executions usually pulled a good crowd, but there must be several hundred people here today. Obviously, the novelty of watching someone being burned to death had been a big draw. The courtyard hummed like a beehive with excitement. The sheriff didn't plan on disappointing them. If there was one thing you could say about him, he knew how to put on a good show. The stake was ready, standing tall in the centre of the courtyard. Kindling was piled at its base, and he'd personally checked that it was dry. One spark would set it ablaze, and the show could begin. And there was its star now, being led forward to take her bow by Gisborne. The sheriff frowned. Gisborne looked on the point of collapse. Could he possibly still be mourning Marion? This was getting ridiculous. The man really did need to pull himself together. Marion had been pretty, but she was hardly irreplaceable. No one was. Not even Gisborne himself, if he continued to stagger around the place like the town drunk after a 4-day bender. The 2 witch-finders who'd pronounced Kate guilty were already on stage with the sheriff. They'd need to confirm her guilt before the sentence was carried out. He liked that. It meant that in the unlikely event that there was some kind of stink, they'd be the ones to take the blame. What a perfect day for an immolation, he murmured. It was. The sun shone bright and the air was crisp, with the first hint of autumn. A perfect day for mercy, maybe? Derek said, stumbling into silence when the sheriff turned to glare at him. Mercy? Derek swallowed nervously, a hand smoothing back his blonde hair. He looked slightly green around the gills, although that might have just been a hangover. The repentant sinner welcomed back into the fold, he said. That sort of thing. Forgiveness is supposed to be good for the soul. Don't tell me, the sheriff said contemptuously. A witch-finder without the stomach for a burning. Whatever happened to taking pride in one's work? I do, Derek said. And naturally, I do. Only normally he makes the accusation, lets the witch pay him off, and then retracts it before anything as unpleasant as an actual execution can happen, Hugh drawled. Oh, that's... Derek spluttered. Very enterprising, the sheriff said cheerfully. But not what's required here. There'll be no retraction today, Hugh assured him. They watched as Kate was bound to the stake with metal chains. They'd melt eventually in the fierce heat, but by then it would be far too late for her to escape. Hugh's strange silver eyes passed over Kate as if she was something inanimate. They looked empty of any feeling. He was, the sheriff realized, a kindred spirit. Tell me, the sheriff asked him, what are your plans when this is over? Nothing in particular. I thought I might spend some time enjoying your, well, very generous token of gratitude. Well, don't leave town without telling me, the sheriff said. I'm sure there'll be more work around here for a man of your singular talents. Especially if Gisborne continued to fall apart so spectacularly, he thought. And speaking of the devil, Gisborne was looking up to the stage now, blinking as if the light hurt him. He made a visible effort to focus when the sheriff caught his eye. We're ready, Guy shouted. She's refused last rites. Just the sentence to be pronounced, then, the sheriff said. I love this bit. Always sounds so official. He clapped his hands, and a tense, expectant silence settled over the crowd. Only Kate wasn't watching him. Her eyes were riveted on the soldier at her side, who held a burning torch perilously close to the kindling beneath her. It was all going well. All the pieces were in place. But where was Hood? If the outlaw didn't show up soon, the sheriff really was going to have to burn Kate alive, which would be fun, but not really the point of the exercise. As the sheriff waited, the spectators began to murmur restlessly. He realized he'd have to make a start or he'd lose them. By the power vested in I, Vasey, he said as slowly as possible. And then he saw the wave of commotion that was churning the crowd, heading towards the stage like a shark for blood. At last, he muttered. Hugh looked at him sharply and then nodded as if a guess had been confirmed. But as the disturbance drew closer, the sheriff began to entertain doubts. Would Hood really dare to be this brazen? The man had a high opinion of himself, but he also usually had some sense of self-preservation. Finally, the newcomer reached the stage, and the sheriff's smile widened into a sneer. Really? Was this the best the pathetic wolf's head could do? A cloak and a leather mask to hide his face? But could the sheriff be wrong? What if this wasn't Hood? He leaned forward to peer more closely at the intruder, but the cloak hid everything beneath it. It was impossible to identify him. My lord, the newcomer said, I am Witchfinder Lazarus. His voice was deep and gritty and probably disguised. It gave nothing away. The sheriff couldn't be certain this was Hood and couldn't risk unmasking him and looking a fool if it wasn't. He'd just have to play along for the moment. It wasn't as if there was anywhere Witchfinder Lazarus could run to. The courtyard was surrounded by the sheriff's men, some in plain view and others carefully hidden.
Witchfinder Lazarus,
the sheriff said.
What brings you so fashionably late to the party, hmm?
Lazarus bowed stiffly.
A party indeed. This festival of foulness you're hosting.
Oh, well put,
the sheriff said.
But as you may have noticed, we were just about to engage in a spot of fumigation.
The other man scuttled closer with the unnerving speed of an insect.
Aye, there's evil to be flushed out here, but it's not tied to that stake.
The sheriff leaned back, relaxing. Ah, so that was the game. Really not a very sophisticated one. He'd expected better of his old adversary.
You're talking about me, aren't you?
He said.
You, my lord?
Was that a note of amusement in Lazarus's voice?
No, I speak of those who stand beside you. The snakes in the garden of Nottingham.
Derek let out an affronted snort as Hugh crossed his arms and regarded Lazarus down his sharp nose.
Brother, he said, you do us a grave injustice. We all serve the same cause.
A flicker of motion was visible in the dark eyeholes of the mask.
I think not, imposter.
Derek drew himself up to his full height.
Imposter? And who are you to call us that? One who follows the true calling.
Lazarus boomed.
One who has no truck with demons, unlike you.